Welcome back, everyone. You know how tech news always seems to revolve around the biggest, the fastest, the most powerful? Well, today, we're diving into a couple of stories that caught my eye, precisely because they're not about being at the very top.
Oh, this is interesting. I'm intrigued. What did you find?
So we're going to untangle this strategic shift from AMD, which, they're behind a lot of the processors and graphics cards we
All
use,
right.
and then we'll connect that to, get this, a massive AI city in the works down in Brazil.
Brazil. Wow. Okay. You've definitely got my attention. Let's hear it.
Yeah, Brazil. We'll get there, I promise. But first, we've got this interview with an AMD executive talking about their GPU plans for the future. And honestly, it's left me scratching my head a little.
Okay. How so?
Well, they're basically saying they're going to put more focus on making more affordable GPUs instead of going head-to-head with NVIDIA, their main competition in that top-tier market.
Interesting. So instead of trying to make the absolute best of the best, they're aiming for what? More of the mainstream market.
Exactly. And what makes it even more interesting is that AMD's been killing it with their CPUs. I mean, some would argue they've even been outperforming Intel's for a while now.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
But even with those superior products, they're still lagging behind Intel when it comes to actual market share.
True. Very true.
So why pull back in the GPU race now when they seem to have a real shot at taking the lead? It doesn't quite add up.
It seems like AMD's playing the long game here, and it all circles back to the massive, and I mean massive, demand for AI. See, their strategy starts to make a lot more sense if you look at what's really driving the need for all this processing power. Data centers.
Data centers.
Yes, and I'm not talking about your average server room. We're talking about these sprawling, giant facilities packed to the brim with specialized GPUs that can handle the incredibly complex calculations needed for AI.
I see.
And it seems like AMD's placing their bets on these data center GPUs rather than the ones we might have in our gaming PCs. They're betting that in the long run, that's where the real profit, the real future lies.
So essentially, they're choosing not to fight for the flashiest part of the market, those top-end gaming TPUs, to focus on the workhorses behind the scenes of this whole AI revolution.
Yeah.
But couldn't that lack of direct competition in that high-end market, the really powerful GPUs, actually end up driving prices up even higher for gamers?
It's definitely a possibility, yeah. But here's what I find so fascinating. I think AMD might be picking up on a much bigger shift happening in computing as a whole. They're acknowledging that the most demanding computing tasks, the ones that require the most power, are migrating into these giant specialized hubs.
Centralizing the power.
Exactly. Think of it this way. It's kind of like the difference between having a generator at home versus drawing power from the grid. AMD's putting their money on the power grid of the future.
And speaking of giant specialized hubs,
Oh.
well, that leads us perfectly into our next story. Buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting. Remember, we were talking about AI City in Brazil earlier.
Right.
This isn't just some small data center they're putting together.
Yeah.
We're talking a potential 4.75 gigawatts of power capacity. To put that into perspective, that's even larger than the entire existing data center market in Brazil.
Wow.
This single project is like building a computing powerhouse completely from scratch.
That's incredible.
So maybe, just maybe, AMD sees the writing on the wall. They're taking a step back from one fight to focus on a market that's about to explode. But, and this is a big but, why Brazil?
Right. Good question.
It's not exactly known as a global tech hub, is it? So what's the advantage of building something like this massive AI city in South America?
Well, that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. See, the CEO of Scala, the company behind this whole AI City project, he actually highlighted one of Brazil's biggest strengths, one that often gets overlooked: renewable energy.
Okay, yeah.
We're talking hydroelectric dams, huge solar farms, wind power, and these aren't just buzzwords. They're absolutely crucial for data centers. These things use an insane amount of electricity.
Oh, yeah. To run all those servers, right?
Exactly. And keeping them cool, that's another massive hurdle. But Brazil, with all its natural resources, they might actually be able to solve both of those problems in a way that a lot of other countries just can't.
So it might seem strange at first glance putting AI City in Brazil.
It does.
But it could actually be like a really smart move. It's a strategic masterstroke.
Yeah.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
Right.
Because Brazil's also kind of known for bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
Red tape, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a roadblock for a project this massive?
Potential.
And what about just the physical distance? I mean, we're talking about a country that's geographically pretty far from a lot of major population centers.
Right.
Doesn't that mean slower data transfer speeds, more latency? How would that impact a project like this, where AI and computing power are so central?
You're hitting on some really important points. Scala, they're definitely going to have to navigate those regulatory hurdles
Yeah.
and those potential latency issues. They'll have to address those too. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. Remember that AMD interview we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, yeah.
The executive, he mentioned that their EPYC server CPUs, they've already got a pretty decent chunk of the global market share.
Okay.
Now, picture this. Imagine if AMD, they replicate that success, but with their data center GPUs. And those GPUs, they become like the beating heart of this huge energy-efficient AI hub in Brazil.
Okay, okay. I'm starting to see how these two stories, AMD's shift and this whole AI city thing, they're kind of two sides of the same coin.
Exactly.
Like, we could be looking at a future where a company that most people associate with, powering gaming PCs, they pivot and become a major, major player in this whole world of AI. And it's all thanks to this huge growing demand for more and more computing power. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back down to earth for a second. What does all of this actually mean for, like, the average person? Someone who maybe isn't glued to all the ups and downs of the tech world, right? Why should they care?
You know, it really raises a fundamental question about the future of computing power itself, because we often think of progress in these terms of faster phones, more powerful laptops. But what if the real revolution, what if it's happening on a much, much larger scale? See, what we might be witnessing here, it's a shift towards this, like, centralization. Instead of everyone needing the absolute best computer at their fingertips, maybe the future is a world where the heavy lifting, the really, really intense processing power needed for things like AI, it's all concentrated in these massive hubs, like this AI city we've been talking about.
So instead of owning the power ourselves, we'd be accessing it remotely.
Yeah.
So kind of like the difference between, like, having a home library versus just relying on a streaming service for movies, right?
Exactly. That's a great analogy. It's like how we've moved from, like you said, personal libraries, CD collections, all of that, to these streaming services for movies, for music. This would be like that, but for computing power.
Yeah.
Your laptop, your tablet, it might become less about raw processing power and more about connecting you to those vast resources out there in the cloud.
That's exciting in a way, but it's also kind of unnerving.
Right.
On the one hand, you have this potential for these incredible advancements in AI, in computing power, things we can't even really imagine yet, probably.
Yeah. Who knows?
But on the other hand, if we're all relying on a handful of these mega data centers, doesn't that also create some, like, vulnerabilities? It's like we're trading one set of problems for another.
It's a trade-off, definitely.
Right. Like, yeah, we unlock all this potential, but then you start thinking about, like, what about data privacy in this future? What about security? If all of our eggs are basically in a few baskets, so to speak, wouldn't that make those baskets, like, really attractive targets?
Absolutely. And it's not even just about, like, malicious actors or anything like that. Think
Yep.
about access. Like, if all of the most powerful computing resources, if they're concentrated in the hands of just a few companies, could that end up creating a digital divide?
Oh, yeah, where
Yeah.
some people are just left behind completely.
Exactly. You know, these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having, like, now as these technologies are being developed, before it's too late. Because it's not just about building the biggest, the best, the most powerful anymore. It's about building responsibly, building inclusively.
That's a really good point. I'm kind of blown away by all of this, to be honest. I mean, we started with what I thought was a pretty straightforward story about AMD and their GPU strategy.
Right.
And we somehow ended up, like, contemplating the entire future of computing power itself. It's kind of wild.
And that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? Like, you start connecting these seemingly unrelated dots and you end up discovering these really fascinating patterns, these potential future scenarios. And I think in this case, with AMD's shift towards data centers, which is clearly being driven by this huge rise of AI, and then you see it exemplified in these incredibly ambitious projects like this AI city in Brazil, I think it suggests that we might be on the verge of a really, really major transformation, like a fundamental shift in how we access, how we utilize computing power as a whole.
So for all of our listeners out there, what would you say is, like, the key takeaway from all of this? What should they be paying attention to in the coming months, years?
I'd say don't just focus on the flashy new gadgets. Don't just focus on the latest software update. You've got to pay attention to these underlying shifts in infrastructure. Pay attention to these strategic moves by companies like AMD. Look at these unexpected locations where innovation is happening. Those are the clues that'll tell you where the technological landscape is actually heading.
It's like that saying, right? The future is already here. It's
Yeah.
just not evenly distributed.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. This was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it really was.
And we hope you enjoyed this exploration of AMD's strategic shift, the rise of AI City, and of course, what it all means for the future of computing power. Until next time.